Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we've got some pretty horrifying stories, natural disasters, near deaths, and deadly animal encounters. A whole range to sink your ears into tonight. So get comfortable, follow me on Twitter, and let the darkness take control. At the time of this story, I was 14 years old and living in Germany with my mother, father, brother, and a dog. My family and I are British, but we've been living in Germany for a few years at this point due to my father's work. It was great. We had an awesome house, lots of friends, and the going was good. To make it even more amazing, my parents were wrapping up the sale of our old house in the UK, which had been on the market for what felt like forever, and selling it from overseas had just become a massive headache for my parents. The closing of this house sale would not only allow my parents to finally relax, but it was going to pay for the holiday of a lifetime. I'm talking white sand, crystal clear blue oceans, elephant rides, staying in a cabin on the beach, the whole 9 yards. Finally, the offer had been made, the paperwork printed and signed, and to say we were excited was an understatement. This must have been around summertime, as I remember we were due to start back at school in a few weeks. So rather than waiting another 12 months before the next summer break, we planned the holiday for the Christmas period instead. No cold, snow, or freezing wind for us. A short time passed and I came home one day and my brother and I knew something bad had happened. My dad had come home early from work. There were many phone calls being made and my mother looked absolutely furious. "What happened?" I asked Mum, hoping to God I wasn't in trouble. "He pulled out," my mother stormed as she slammed the pots down to get dinner ready. The bloody actually pulled out of buying the house. Can you believe it? "What? No!" my brother and I both exclaimed. Yes. So after signing everything, he then has the cheek to ask us to drop the asking price about 5k. I don't bloody think so. He can forget it. My mother calmed down after a bit and sadly told us that it would mean no exotic holiday. We had to stay home instead. We reassured her it was fine despite feeling incredibly disappointed. My brother was 8 at the time and we were really close, so we'd already planned all these amazing activities that we were going to do while we were out there. So sadly the sale was called off and we stayed home for Christmas. The year, however, was 2004, and our destination? The coastline of Sri Lanka. I woke up that Boxing Day only to be greeted by the horror of the most destructive and deadly tsunami in living memory. The coastline, the homes and businesses, and almost 250,000 people just suddenly wiped away in the blink of an eye. I was glued to the TV for most of that day, too horrified to look away, just watching the death toll rise and rise. Newscasters kept showing the before and after photos, and I recognized the wooden cabins we wanted to stay at. We never would have stood a chance. I'm 29 now, and to this day still carry an enormous sense of guilt, and I try to avoid talking about it whenever weird events come up in conversation. So to the bloke who messed up our house deal and ruined our family holiday, thank you for saving our lives. This was a few years ago, on a night scuba dive. There were 8 of us in the group, including our dive master and his assistant. We had just finished our dive and were gathered up in a circle ready to ascend and get out of the water when my dive master freezes. He takes his flashlight and pointing it outside our circle of divers, he catches something circling us with the beam. Turns out it was a 12-foot-long great white shark. At this point, half the group are trying to keep the shark illuminated as it circles us, and remarkably everyone stayed calm. The only thing that went through my mind were iterations of those two thoughts. Don't look like a yummy, delicious, fatty seal, and that I hope I taste terrible. My dive master gets our attention and slowly puts his thumb up, and then makes an upwards motion with all of us beginning to ascend, and the shark kept with us until we were maybe 10 feet from the surface. Then it turned off into the darkness and was gone. I did not go back into the ocean for about a week after that. When I was 13, I lived in a small town in rural Zimbabwe. We had a large, single-story house with a massive garden that surrounded the property. On one side of the house, the garden narrowed between our house and the fence of the neighbor's house. At the end of this narrow section was an empty, decrepit, cement-lined pond that I had recently cleared of rubble and plant life with the plan of eventually filling it again. One afternoon, my friend Dan and I were messing around in the garden, and for some reason I found myself running down the narrowed section of garden straight towards the pond. Suddenly, for some reason that I can't really articulate, dread and fear washed over my body like 1,000 needles raining down from the sky. I stopped dead in my tracks about 2 meters from the pond and found myself breathlessly staring at it motionally. From the crack on one side of the pond, a long snake, perhaps a meter long, emerged 3 or 4 seconds later. It was a Mozambique spitting cobra, a large, aggressive, and extremely venomous snake that wouldn't hesitate to bite or spit at threats. Like a 13-year-old boy running past its new home in the wall of the pond, for instance. I slowly backed away, and the pond was filled with sand the next day. To this day, I don't know what it was that stopped me dead in my tracks, but if I continued, perhaps I wouldn't be here today. I work as an engineer in a data center cooling plant. We're responsible for basically everything in the building, mechanical, electrical, HVAC, plumbing. So the engineer I'm relieving tells me there's an odd sound coming from the Con Ed vaults. This is where huge transformers are that step down the 26,000 volts or so to a voltage the building can actually use. We're not allowed in those vaults. They're locked and only Con Ed has the keys. So he leaves and I take a walk by the vaults. I had never actually heard electricity arcing through the air before, but I knew I was hearing it then. I called Con Ed's emergency line and told them to get out there ASAP. A crew of 2 guys showed up. They seemed calm and disinterested in the elevator all the way up. "It's probably just a contact chattering," they said. We got off the elevator and they start heading down the hall. The sound was way louder now. We weren't even near the vaults and there was no mistaking it. Both guys stopped dead in their tracks and kind of hunkered down. I saw the color drain from them. I wasted no time getting back in the elevator. If you've never seen a video of a large transformer explosion, go to YouTube. These transformers are not like the ones you see up on utility poles. They're as big as a couple of trucks stacked on top of each other. Anyone on the floor, when one of them cooked off, would be gone. And we have 8 of them. Eventually, the con guys got in, but not before cutting the power to the entire building. They called in right away, cut the power, then a bunch of more Con Ed guys showed up to check out the damage. Apparently there's a conductor at the top of these transformer called a hammerhead. The insulation had burnt right off, and it just got worse from there. Everyone in the utility was glad we caught it when we did. There's a small island called Ilha de Queimada Grande off the coast of Sao Paulo, Brazil, that is home to the highest concentration of golden lancehead vipers, one of the most venomous species of snake in the world. They are unique to this island alone, and its venom causes your flesh to rot off to your bones. The island is so densely packed with these snakes that there are up to 5 snakes per square meter on this island. You could stand anywhere on the island and be no more than a few feet away from a golden lancehead viper. Apparently there was only a lighthouse keeper who lived on the island with his family, but they didn't survive long. After a while, snakes crawled through their windows. Panicking, they ran outside into the forest where they were confronted by thousands of snakes, and were bitten numerous times running through the forest, hanging overhead by branches. They all died before they could reach their boat, and their bodies were found scattered through the forest later by a Navy vessel making a routine supply stop. There was also an attempt to build a banana plantation on the island, but that quickly ended in disaster as all the workers were dying from the vipers. The island is forbidden to civilians by the Brazilian Navy. This was around 2007-2008. I was about 12 at the time, and me and my dad were heading up to Cape York. It was a good few days' drive to Cairns from where we lived in Bundaberg, Queensland, and we were in no rush. We finally got into Cairns at around 10:30 p.m. We were both really excited to cross the Daintree River and really start the adventure. It was decided that we would hang out at my uncle's place for a few days, as we didn't see him often. My uncle is a dead-set straight out of the 70s, Lennon glasses wearing pot-smoking hippie musician guys. He also loved fishing, and his favourite place to go was the Daintree. Anyway, the morning rolls around and we head out to launch the boat at around 6 a.m. and fish away for most of the day. Didn't catch anything, but we were kept entertained by my uncle telling us all his stories. As the sun is beginning to set, we head over this little spit of white sand way over the side of the river. My uncle was dead set that he could find his way back in the dark, so we hung about on the little private beach talking, drinking and cooking a lamb roast in the campfire oven. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Daintree has a bit of a lizard problem. And when I say lizards, I mean huge-ass crocodiles that will mess you up 8 ways to Sunday. My uncle is adamant that they don't come this far out, as the water starts getting a bit cold for them, so we aren't too worried. So as we're sitting there, we notice that my uncle isn't doing much talking, he's just kind of sitting and listening. We ask him what's up, and he sort of motions us to shut up. We don't really hear much at all, but he's got the both of us pretty spooked. All of a sudden he jumps up and runs as fast as you'd please to the tinny and grabs this big long bamboo spear thing. One of us had to ask him earlier in the day what it was for, and he said he keeps it around in case crocs got too close, he could give them a jab from the boat and they'd swim away and leave him be. Well, he takes a few steps off into the dark, jabs into this patch of mangroves with this long-ass bamboo pokey stick, and me and my dad just about died when we hear this big scaly thing take off into the water at 50 miles an hour. We noped out of there without finishing our roast. Chills my blood to know that thing was a few feet away from us while we were having a good time. If any of us would have walked off in that direction for a slash, we'd have been chomped for sure. Quite a number of years ago, on my first trip to Africa, I was staying in a group campground in the Serengeti. The camp had quite a number of tents and was approved by the park management and was allotted one ranger with an AK-47 that looked like it was from the 70s. He patrolled around at night, but the camp had no barrier and he couldn't be everywhere. I was on my way back to my tent after playing cards into the night with those old crappy headlamps, which I had pointed to the ground. The camp was mostly empty, and my tent was at the farther end of where people were staying. I was watching my step as I looked, and the wash from my headlamp gives off enough light for me to see 2 pairs of eyes, one amber and one blue, stare back at me from about 20 feet away in the dark. I can't see what it is, they're just staring at me. Not small eyes either, probably about 2 or so feet off the ground. There's a point where you're so absolutely terrified your entire being goes into overdrive. Fight or flight doesn't ever happen. You can't feel anything, your body continues to work on its own accord, but all your mental capacity is focused on what's right in front of you. No adrenaline, almost like an out-of-body experience. I'm completely unaware of it, but I continue to walk, and since I don't show any change of behavior, the eyes turn off me and walk away. I go into my tent as calm as can be, just in complete shock, climb into bed, and wake up the next morning, bring the ranger over and find the tracks. Those eyes belonged to 2 spotted hyena pack hunters, on par with lions. I've had other encounters in Africa over the years, but that's been the only time I've ever been alone in the presence of a superior number of predators without any kind of weapon to defend myself, especially at night. This story takes place nearly 30 years ago now, and is a memory I have spoken a lot about in therapy. The day was like any other. I got up in the morning, tired, and really couldn't be bothered to leave for school. But my mother was at my door nagging at me to get up. I open my eyes and take a good look around my room, spot my uniform on the chair from yesterday, and get ready to have a shower. Within about half hour, I'm ready to leave to school. I put on the bare minimum of makeup that we were allowed to wear and go sit at the table to have breakfast. I see my brother watching TV, and my dad is reading the newspaper. My mum looks like she's getting ready for another day of doing whatever she does at home, cooking, cleaning, and the like. She was also about 8 months pregnant. So we're just there having small talk before I look at my watch and realize I have to make the groggy journey to school. I walk down the 5 or 6 flights of stairs until I get to the bottom floor and slowly make my way out. I make the bus in good time and reach school before the bell. Now, school was a blur, and I don't remember what time it happened exactly, but from one moment to another, the ground started to shake. Earthquakes are not that uncommon where I live, but this one was different. This one was huge. We were instructed to all get underneath our desks. We all had individual desks at the time, and so we did. I could hear girls crying near me, even guys. Everyone was frightened. The ground was shaking, the ceiling. I was so scared it was going to collapse on me, and thankfully it did not. By the time the earthquake was over, we left. But when we looked out, we saw that we were fortunate. The amount of carnage that had been inflicted on our city was huge. Buildings that I had gone past on my bus ride were no longer standing. Streets were covered in debris and rubble, and there were cries and the sounds of emergency sirens everywhere. As you can imagine, with any situation like this, the first thing you think about is your family. I wondered about my brother. The last time I saw him was watching TV. Or my mum, her baby. My dad. How were they, and the rest of my family? I desperately wanted to leave, to run home and make sure my mum was okay. My dad worked across town. I didn't know if he was safe either. My brother went to this exact school, but I'm sure he'd be fine, right? Doubt is what really frightened me. Not knowing if that morning had been the last time I'd see my parents, if my ungrateful ass and not saying thank you to my mum would be the last gesture that she'd remember me if she had perished. It was about 5 hours or so before the school let us leave. Thankfully, during that time I found my brother, who was a few years younger, safe and sound. And I think I cried more than I ever had in my life when I found out he was alright. But the fear still consumed my heart, and I needed to find my family. Things didn't go well from this point on. My dad suffered serious injuries, and unfortunately lost his life to them a few days later in the absolutely oversaturated hospitals. When I was finally allowed to go home, or at least a semblance of a home, I realized that our house was no longer standing. It was an apartment building, and it had pretty much collapsed. Eventually, they found my mother. She didn't make it. These things still haunt me, and was one of the reasons I moved from that country a long time ago. I still don't know if I'll ever go back. I'm deadly scared of earthquakes. So me and this group of women, all of us friendly acquaintances that did group hikes, were hiking single file on a very thin trail through the mountains. My one problem with this group was that they insisted on talking loudly throughout the hike. I like to try and spot wildlife, so I ended up being in the front of the line in the hopes that I would see some critters before all the loud chatter drove them off. So I'm walking in the front, chilling, admiring all the thick forest and trees, and I take a step and put my foot down. As I do that, I hear a rustle, so I look down and I lift up my other foot to take another step. Less than an inch from my toes was this huge snake. I never saw how long it was, but it was around 3 inches in diameter and it started moving. Now this area had about 3 different types of rattlesnakes, along with copperheads, cottonmouths, and very rarely coral snakes. So I've been taught a healthy respect for snakes, as well as how to tell the difference between most of the species. I didn't even get a good look at the color before my hindbrain kicks in. This huge jolt runs through my body, like I stuck a fork in a socket. And before I even fully comprehend, oh hey, there's a snake, I'm 3 feet in the air and trying to travel backwards. I like to imagine it as one of those graceful anime leaps where they jump 20 back before a fight. But in reality, it was more like a terrified cat springing into the air shouting, "Jesus Christ!" I crash into the woman behind me who yelps and turns to face me, but as she does, she spots the snake and starts yelling at the top of her lungs. I was the one who nearly stepped on it, and this lady was more scared than I was. Well, the snake is no fool and decides, screw this, I was just chilling and sunning myself and these ladies come along and start screaming. I'm out of here. Thanks for ruining my morning. It slithers off into the undergrowth, and when it does, I see that its scales are pitch black. It is literally just a rat snake, both harmless and friendly. My grandma has 6-foot rat snakes living in her backyard, and she feeds them leftover chickens sometimes. Totally harmless. I felt like one hell of a fool, but that snake scared the bejesus out of me, and one of the other women took up the head of the lion for quite some time afterwards. I used to climb at Joshua Tree a lot a decade ago, so we would camp there frequently. One Halloween we were hanging out by the fire and a group of 3 guys walk up and ask if we wanted to head to the Chasm of Doom. Without hesitation I replied, yeah, sure. My friends were less enthusiastic, but I was able to convince them to come along. This place had a certain amount of legend surrounding it in jade tree climbing circles, so it was somewhat known to us, but we still had yet to get there. This was pre-Instagram, so there wasn't much info on it at the time, other than how to get there and its talus cave. As we walked over, the guys were filling us in on the tradition of the chasm. Always take first timers at night, no headlamps or lights allowed. The leaders shout beta. Instructions were to go on, what to avoid, and how not to die. If you have to follow it, you want to make it through. If you cheat and use a light while in there, you risk upsetting the spirits or something, and we laughed that off. As we reached the end of our walk to the entrance of the cave, one of our guides asked if any of us had claustrophobia issues. I laughed and asked why, to which they described the birth canal, a horizontal crack that you have to wiggle through at some point in the cave that was very cramped. After hearing this, one of my friends noped out of there, and being that the other friend and he were dating at the time, they both decided to leave and return to camp. That left me standing at the base of a hill ready to scramble up the mouth of a cave with 3 strangers I'd met 15 minutes ago to be led through, blind. Sounds perfectly safe and rational. We scramble up over boulders, under boulders, past yucca sprouting from cracks, rats scurried around, and the mood was starting to rise above the mountains across the valley as we reached the mouth of the chasm. It was a vertical crack no more than a few feet wide. We file in one by one, with the leader instructing us where to step, where to place our hands for balance, and warning us about protrusions from the ceiling so we don't hit our heads. The pace was slow and it was not terribly interesting for the first few minutes. as I was more interested in how my brain was shifting the way it perceives physical space through touch rather than sight. In the complete darkness, I was constructing a three-dimensional map of the cave in my head. It felt like I was looking at the physical space, even in the pitch black. For a while, I remained more fascinated by this than the actual activity, up until the point where the ground had been relatively flat with some small obstacles to avoid so you didn't trip and fall on your face. The leader had just instructed us that there was a large boulder you had to crouch under, and then immediately after there would be something that you had to climb over. He did not state any details about these objects, so figuring out your way around them was all up to you and your appendages to identify the parameters of the space that you were in and how to navigate it. Again, this all felt fascinating until I tried to climb over it. I was last in line and everyone was still here, so I knew that moving forwards was not going to result in my death or anything, but my confidence was completely sucked out of me by a very simple comment by the leader. When you climb over, make sure you stay to the right. If you go too far to the left, you'll fall. At this point, the wonder of the process of navigating through the cave gave way to a growing sense of anxiety over real risk or injury. My relaxed state was now being corrupted by scenarios of falling down a hole in complete darkness. To make matters worse, when I gingerly tried to reach down to the other side of my toes to find solid footing, all I found was air. I wondered how far down was ground beneath me. Was I in the wrong position? Am I dangling over a potential fall? I had long gotten over my fear of heights thanks to climbing, but this created a unique form of vertigo. All the physiological responses were there: tense muscles, anxiety, disorientation, and I felt stuck. Part of me wanted to go back, but being that everyone had already passed it, the thought of navigating my way back out solo seemed not only risky for my physical well-being, but my pride too. I was tense with anxiety, but convinced myself to just commit to whatever drop there was. I let it go and started to fall, a total of 2 inches. Along the way there were more situations like this, including some sections that required climbing blind, making a wrong turn and backtracking. Even though I had come to realize that my anxiety was also flying blind, I tried to rationalize it away. It still persisted. It didn't help that the leader was dramatizing every danger to make us think we got lost. We all talked crap to lighten the mood when it got too much. Finally, we got to the birth canal. They worked their way through it, and I listened to each of their complaints as they struggled with it, hoping to have an easier go. I wasn't terribly claustrophobic being stuck in a tight place in the dark, but it wasn't something I wanted to experience. I turned around, lied on my back, and started through head first. If you can imagine a penguin trying to move between 2 mattresses on his back, you can imagine the position I was in. Movement was slow and restrained. My back slid on a slab and my chest was pressed against the roof. I got stuck. I had to back out a bit, move in a slightly different trajectory, and find a spot that had more clearance. Finally, I made it through and had to climb up about 10 feet until I rejoined the group on the top of some boulder. We were now boulder hopping back over the chasm we had just navigated through. Essentially, it's just a crack in the rocks and large boulders would fall in and get stuck, essentially creating a roof. To continue, we had to head back the way we came, following the chasm back. It felt like we were in a Donkey Kong level in a sense. The boulders didn't completely cover the chasm and the drops were about 15 to 30 feet according to the leader. I wasn't sure if it was an exaggeration at first, but by the time we reached the end of that section, the moonlight was shining through, and I could see that any fall would be very serious. Finally made it to the top and climbed some sketchy slab to get a great view of the valley being lit by the moon. We yelled down to other people heading into the mouth of the cave, and sat there for a while taking in the afterglow of the adrenaline, drank a beer, and laughed off the melodrama of the whole endeavor. It was honestly one of the most fun things I'd ever done, but it certainly scared the crap out of me. We then had to find our way down, which ended up requiring some awkward down climbs as we ended up going the wrong way. At least we had the moon for that part. My boyfriend and I were doing a road trip around Scotland last year. We were sleeping in the car during the nights and would get up, pack everything, and head somewhere else the next day. One night we stayed in this gorgeous bay right by the sea. Beautiful sunset, lots of other campers, it was ideal. We liked it so much we wanted to hang around the area a bit longer, so the next night we stayed in the same bay. However, when I got back to the bay to set up camp for the night, there was no one else there. Bit weird, but whatever, no big deal. It was late when we arrived and it was already starting to get a bit dark. My boyfriend started cooking dinner. As he was doing so, I decided to take some rubbish over to the bins about 100 feet away. I got to the bins and suddenly heard this weird hissing sound at the top of the cliffs next to us. It just kept going on and on up there, then it stopped, so I thought it might be owls. They do weird stuff like that, right? Then I heard it again, only this time it was coming down the cliff to my level, and it was approaching me. I shone the torch around, but couldn't see anything, so I legged it back to the car and told my boyfriend. He sort of shrugged and carried on cooking, then suddenly stopped. He looked off to where I heard the noise for a moment, then started packing the car. I asked him what was going on, but he just said to keep packing. We got in the car, packed up, and we were preparing to leave when headlights came from down the lane. A police van drove past towards the end of the bay and looped back and left again. No idea what that was about. Either way, we left the bay and found somewhere more populated to stay. When I asked my boyfriend why he'd wanted to leave so quickly, he said he heard the exact same thing I had heard, the hissing from up the cliffs, descending to our level and approaching, getting louder. Noped right out of that place the very next morning. A couple of friends and I drove into a horror movie once, by accident. It was either late November or early December, about 5 or 6 years ago. I was deeply religious at the time, and we were heading to one of those living nativity things where they have pretend actors to be the Virgin Mary, Joseph, the wise men, etc. And they kind of put on an outdoor show. It was held at a Christian campground outside of a nearby city, and we didn't know the area very well. We had someone give us directions. This was winter in the US, so it was already getting dark when we set out. We got to the area just fine, but we forgot the name of the exit we were supposed to take to reach the grounds. Luckily, the campgrounds had a big sign right next to an exit, so we assumed this was the way to go. We took the road and thought nothing of it. Crisis averted. The city this campground is next to is actually pretty large, and the exit we took is very close to a shopping district, so it wasn't like we started in the middle of nowhere. But very abruptly the exit turned from civilization to deep woods. We thought, well, it's a campground, so that's about right, and carried on driving. Pretty soon we passed a clearing on the right. The clearing was maybe 50 feet, and then woods again. And at the very edge of the woods, it wasn't full night yet so you couldn't see, was this huge stone gate with wrought iron doors. It looked like a cemetery gate, but it didn't lead to a path or anything, just trees. Had no fence around it either, just gate. So we kept going, remarking to each other that it was kind of creepy, but still we didn't think much of it. It was starting to get foggy at this point. I felt like maybe I should point out that despite it being winter, it wasn't that cold, and there wasn't any snow. A little while later, we came to some houses, and this is where things got weird. The first house was just standard white suburban house, but in the driveway, which was very short, was a van with all the doors open. The hazard lights were on too. The car was on, but nobody was in or around it, and the house was completely dark. We were a little nervous now, wondering if maybe something bad had happened, like an accident or something, and the driver of our car slowed down to look. Then my other friend in the front pointed ahead, and it turns out all of the houses on the street were like this on both sides of the road. Lights out, cars in the driveway, all of the doors on the cars open with the hazards on. At this point we were more than a little freaked out, thinking we'd driven straight into Silent Hill or a particularly mean prank if nothing else. Though it seems a little strange for it to just be a community-wide prank in the middle of winter, nowhere close to Halloween. We still haven't seen any people, mind you. For whatever reason, we still continue to drive, maybe to get out of there faster. There was a little bend in the road, and the instant we started through it, this massive black dog, sort of German shepherd looking thing, came out of nowhere and ran full tilt to the driver's side of the car. I'm still not sure if the dog actually made contact with the car, but if not, it did get incredibly close. After charging at us, it didn't retreat either. It stayed in the road, barking its heads off. Our driver did a quick U-turn and we got out of there as fast as possible, ditching the nativity thing, and never tried to go back. We found out when we got home and talking to the person who gave us directions that it wasn't even the right exit we were on. And now, several years later, we're not exactly sure which exit we took that night. All I know is I'm glad we chose to get out of there when we did. I didn't want any part of whatever was going on that night. Hard pass, no thanks. When I was 12, my family, including my mum, my dad, my sister who was 16, and our dog, Dawn, moved into a mobile home in a mobile home park. I was a horrible child. I had no respect for my parents or their rules and ran away on several occasions. My parents were at the end of their tether, so they signed me up for 4-H and brought me my first pair of chickens. As I got further involved with the showing and showmanship, I acquired a good flock of chickens and needed a place to house them. My 4-H leader lived at a dairy farm across the street of the mobile home park and offered a good chunk of land to build an aviary. My 4-H leader, Mrs. Johnson, had a daughter my age, and we became fast friends. I went to the dairy every day and was shown all the daily happenings of dairy life. My favorite place was the sick pen, as I was going to be a veterinarian. I helped the vet and was even taught how to pull a calf if their mother was having trouble. I stuck my arm up there, but my arm wasn't long enough, and the vet let me help pull, and I got to tend to the calf once it was on the ground. Now to the meat of this story. My friend who lived in the dairy would love taking off our shoes and socks and walking through the cow pens, where there was thick manure, and it was slowly moving across the deep parts. We would get manure up to our legs and all over our clothes. The smell was horrible. One day we were walking through the pens, and I always knew the pens that held the bulls, and I knew better than to go into them because bulls can get pretty aggressive when they're protecting their ladies. Sandy and I are nearing the middle of the pen when I look back and she's sitting on the pipe coral just looking at me. I was confused until I saw the herd of cows part, and out steps the bull. We're staring at each other, and I notice which bull he is. It's Hurricane, the meanest bull at the dairy. I take a step back, but I'm in the deepest part of the manure and my feet are sticking. I take a step, and he takes a step, and he starts to snort loudly, telling me he's coming for me. I turn and try to run, but my feet are not working, and with every step I take, Hurricane takes two. I'm heading for the pipe coral, and just as I'm throwing myself headfirst into a diving motion through the pipes, I feel his head touch my feet as I fall to the ground in a sticker bush. Sandy and I never walked through the pens again, and we slowly lost interest in our friendship. I guess our friendship was held together by manure. To this day, every time I drove by one of the dairies and smelled the wafting scent of manure on a foggy day, I remember all the fun I had at the dairy, and also the day that I was nearly killed by Hurricane. I had the pleasure of going on the Chernobyl tour 6 years ago in May. Kiev was so incredibly beautiful. Seeing what happened is devastating, but the tour was creepy. More mosquitoes than I've ever seen in my life. Only buildings we had free range in was an old elementary school. We got a poke inside the theatre, but not past the main entrance, and we could walk the stands at their football stadium. People still live there and in part of the buffer zone. There are still shops in the green zone, which I believe is a 5-mile radius from the plant. I remember when we pulled up to the plant and got out, our tour guide said, "Just so you know, This sarcophagus is very unstable and could collapse at any minute. That was my first I don't want to be here thought. On a side note, Ukrainians are some of the most hospitable, nicest and friendliest people I've ever met. I truly did not want to leave and wish those still fighting for freedom their best of luck. The ocean always freaks me out. Imagine this. You're treading water on the surface of the Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific, the deepest part of the world's ocean. There's a storm raging and the waters are violent. It's the middle of the night and everything is pitch black. The water is frigid cold, and wave upon wave relentlessly hit you under the surface. You glimpse a faint light from the moon slightly illuminating the turbulent waters as you struggle to stay afloat. Gasping for air, you glance around desperately, looking for anything that could help you. Your heart sinks as you realize there's nothing but ocean for thousands of miles. Then a giant wave slams you under the surface, plunging you deep into the water. As you sink into the dark abyss, the thought of 7 miles of water beneath you horrifies you, and you have no idea what terror lurks under the darkness. You struggle to push yourself back to the surface, but your arms and legs have given up. This is you. Anyone would be terrified of this. I know I was. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. Did you enjoy tonight's video? Let me know. If you are part of the 74% now who aren't subscribed to the channel but do listen frequently, go ahead and subscribe. I mean, it's free. And you can press the button right next to it to be informed of new content that launches every single day. Go on, do it. Or the little girl who laughed in yesterday's video will haunt your nightmares. Anyway, hope everyone's good. I'm good. This video was actually selected by my patrons, but funny story, I've been holding off on doing natural disasters for about a year because I had a cool idea for the video, but it never materialized. And I had to put in terrifying places and environment stories mixed in, but it was like animals and stuff, and it became all kind of mixed, but still, I liked the video. I thought it was an interesting and different one. The earthquake one gave me the feels. A lot. Damn, earthquakes are scary. Anyway, hope everyone has had a good night. If you're still awake, watch another one of my videos, because I've got a lot of them. I'm going to leave it here though now. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.